What is a border anyways? In today's lesson, we'll be trying to answer this question by taking a closer look at borders and states. And in order to do this, we'll be trying to answer the following questions. What are borders? What is the difference between a country and a nation? How are borders determined? And what happens when borders cannot be agreed upon? Now to start off with, we have to ask, what is a border? Now according to National Geographic, a border is the boundary of a state or any political unit defining its jurisdiction and spatial limits of its ability to enforce political decisions. Now this is something we often take for granted, the idea that borders are entirely man-made constructs. Even when they follow geologic features such as rivers or mountains, it is people who have decided upon their own sets of criteria where a border will exist. They are man-made constructs at the end of the day. Another concept that we often take for granted is what exactly a country is. So officially, countries are also known as states. They are governed entities, for example, Canada, or a sub-entity within it. And nations are an ethnic group committed to a political area or homeland. They're, again, a group that has some kind of defining characteristic, a common heritage. So groups like the Palestinians or the Kurds. And nations can sometimes have their own country, but not always. So groups like the Palestinians and the Kurds do not have their own countries, although there are movements within those places to have control of their homeland. So the idea of an independent Palestine or a Kurdistan in some of these areas. And since the end of World War II, the nation-state model has dominated geopolitics, and the idea that self-determination will determine which countries exist and not. That if a group of people connected to a homeland, if enough of them want to be independent, they should have a right to pursue that end goal. Since the end of World War II, we haven't seen many countries invading other countries to take them over, respecting state sovereignty. And again, if you have a group within your country, if enough of them vote to separate, there should be some kind of respect for that. That's not to say that disputes don't arise or tensions don't still exist. Within Canada, we have, for example, the Quebec separatist movement, but there is, again, some legitimacy to these claims. This is kind of the system that's dominated geopolitics since the end of World War II. Now, a state comes into existence when established states recognize its existence and when it possesses basic geographic characteristics. So again, in order to become a country, other countries have to acknowledge that you exist. They have to accept your independence. That might be because your group had a referendum. So thinking back to the Quebec referendum of 1995, that referendum was unsuccessful. Just under half of the population of Quebec voted for separating, and just over half voted to remain in Canada. So Quebec did not separate. However, there are still separatists in Quebec who want to become their own country. And it's not like anybody can just declare independence. I can't say I'm my own sovereign country and my house is now its own country and I get to make the laws of my house. The government of Canada is not going to acknowledge that. So it's only when other countries begin to acknowledge that you are independent that you actually have that sovereignty. They have to agree not to impede upon your sovereignty. A state must also possess territory and a permanent population. So one recent example that sort of challenges this is a group like ISIS, which controlled territory in the Middle East and, in a lot of ways operated like a state. They had their own laws and their own police forces. Were trying to run like basic utilities, their own sort of system of government, but were not recognized as a country by anybody. And since then, they've lost a lot of their territory. Since 2016, the vast majority of the territory they once controlled, they have lost back to Syrian and Iraqi forces. A country must also possess an organized economy, transportation networks, and communication networks. These are all things which you need in order to have a fully functioning state. Now, with that in mind, it's not always obvious what is and what is not a country. So let's go through a few examples here of countries that kind of blur the line between what exactly is a country. So the first one here is Kosovo. Now, Kosovo is a territory in Eastern Europe, and it actually declared independence in 2008 from Serbia. it has its own government. It has some authority and some sovereignty to enforce laws within its territory, and 110 countries recognize its sovereignty. However, Serbia does not recognize it, and as a result, it is not, by our best definitions, considered a country. It's not a member of the United Nations. It's not universally recognized as a country. Another challenging example is Taiwan. Now, Taiwan is an island off the coast of China. It's long been a part of China. Now, during the Communist Revolution in China, in 1949, the nationalist government fled to Taiwan as a national redoubt because they could not control the Chinese mainland anymore, so they retreated to Taiwan and set up their own government and claimed to still be the legitimate government of all of China. And in fact, they remained China's representative at the United Nations until 1971. The government of Taiwan represented all of China until 1971. And the government of Taiwan was recognized as the rightful government of China by the United States until this time as well. At that point, this was during the Nixon presidency, that's when the People's Republic of China was finally recognized as the true sovereign government of China. And this is one of the reasons why Donald Trump's call to the Taiwanese president was so controversial. It upset decades of policy that acknowledged the one China policy, that Taiwan was a part of China. Today, Taiwan operates essentially as its own country. But for diplomatic reasons, it is still recognized as part of China. This is why during the Olympics, Taiwanese athletes compete under the moniker of Chinese Taipei in order to not offend China. We can't recognize that these people are from Taiwan. We have to call them Chinese Taipei, and it's sort of a compromise deal. So Taiwan, by all definitions, is not a country, even though it operates in a lot of ways like one. A final interesting example is Vatican City. So Vatican City is located inside of the city of Rome. It's home to the Pope and is the headquarters of the Catholic Church. It's only about 100 acres of land and has about 800 permanent residents. Despite all these quirks, Vatican City is a country. It's recognized as a country by every other country in the world. And there are some historical reasons as to why the Vatican has its own territory. It goes back to the Papal States and during the unification of Italy. But Vatican City is a sovereign state today. So despite being the smallest country in the world and having, the population the size of a small town, it is considered a country. So as we can see from these examples, the lines between what is and was not a country can be blurred quite easily. So the next question we want to think about is how borders are determined. Today, borders are mostly fixed. For the most part, countries have agreed to accept international borders and the sovereignty of other states. Again, in the post-World War II world, countries acknowledge that within another country's borders, that country has the right to do what they want. Again, we don't see many examples of countries invading other countries to take their land. And also, it's easier to make borders nowadays. Thinking about mapping technology, it's a lot easier to make maps and to make precise borders with GPS technology, for example. It's a lot easier to come up with these precise, exact definitions. Now, sometimes borders follow on natural features. So, for example, the border between Spain and France follows the crest of the Pyrenees Mountains. Other borders are simply drawn on a map, sometimes with reference to longitude and latitude. So the majority of the border between Canada and the US falls along the 49th parallel. And this was decided upon by treaty. It was kind of a point that was mutually agreed upon. They would pick this point. Instead of just arbitrarily drawing a line on the map, they decided to pick the 49th degree of latitude as that marker. And speaking of the Canada-US border, it's kind of an interesting example of the border. It's the world's longest undefended border. It's over 8,891 kilometers long. Most of it is in the wilderness. So you can see on this picture on the left here, this is what the vast majority of the Canada-US border would look like. Just kind of open wilderness, trees, forests. In some cases, we have, in fact, along much of the Canada-U.S. border, in these forested areas, there are small clearings to designate exactly where that border is. But for the most part, you could very easily wander into the other country and not even recognize it unless a border agent came up to you and told you you were illegally entering the other country. And there are plenty of official border crossings, however, where you are legally allowed to enter Canada or the U.S. The only legal way to get into the country. Now, borders are not always so readily accepted. When two countries cannot agree upon a border, we end up with what's called a border dispute. Now, border disputes can be benign if they're over something like an uninhabited island where there's no resources, which is where an awful lot of border disputes take place. People drew lines on a map a long time ago, and now there's a dispute as to whether or not this small island actually counts as part of my country or your country. But in other cases, they can be major points of tension and potentially lead to violent conflicts. So to take a closer look, we will examine 3 current border disputes. The first one is Hans Island, an island that's disputed between Denmark and Canada. So Hans Island is a small island that's only 1.3 square kilometers, and it's located in the center of the Nares Strait between Ellesmere Island and northern Greenland. When the area was mapped in the 1970s, both Canada and Denmark claimed the island. And again, this is an uninhabited island, but it does have some implications. There are resources in the Arctic that both of these countries want access to. There is the Northern Passage, which, as climate change makes the summers longer in the Arctic, is going to be used more and more for shipping. So again, every little bit of territory that you can lay claim to enhances your claims in the Arctic. Now, again, this is not a violent dispute. There's no risk that Canada and Denmark are going to go to war over this island anytime soon. But again, it's not been an easy solution. So they've been negotiating for decades to try to come to some sort of resolution. Many possible solutions have been negotiated, and it's been more serious since the early 2010s. But at this point, no firm official resolution has been made yet. The most likely outcome of this is going to be that the countries agree to split the island in half, which is interesting because at the moment, both Canada and Denmark only have one border. They only border one country, so Canada only borders the U.S. If this island is to be split in half, this will be a second country that Canada shares a border with. Border disputes are not always over land. A major border dispute taking place right now is in the South China Sea. So this is a dispute between China, Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, and other neighboring countries over nautical boundaries. And this is important because it gives them access to shipping lanes and resources in the sea. The U.S. is particularly interested in this because, again, they're major trading partners with these countries, and they've tried to enforce international law by patrolling naval ships through the area. They argue that China is overstepping its bounds and trying to declare that its nautical border goes way farther than is the agreed upon norm. China has responded to this, however, by building artificial islands in the sea. They've literally gone and built their own islands and said, okay, fine, here's our island. We built it. This is our territory. So now our border extends out to here. So this is a major point of tension. And these islands have been controversial in the international community. In July 2016, the United Nations actually ruled against China in arbitration, but so far China has refused to acknowledge the ruling. One of the issues is that China has begun to militarize these islands. They've placed runways and missiles on these islands. So again, it's one thing to say, China, you're wrong, and to rule against them. But if they're willing to put, weapons and militarize those islands, there's only so much you can do to actually enforce that decision. And so this map here is showing the disputed islands and nautical boundaries. And as you can see, China is claiming far out beyond where it would be normally accepted as their nautical boundary, way out into the South China Sea. And finally, some border disputes have the potential to lead to serious armed conflicts, as we've seen in Kashmir. Now, Kashmir is a region in the northwest Indian subcontinent that is claimed by primarily India and Pakistan, but a small part of it is also claimed by China. And each country believes they own some areas of the region. And at times this has led to some conflicts in the region. there have been uneasy truces, and it's led to an unstable peace. And this is made worse because India and Pakistan, they're the two that are most in conflict with each other over Kashmir. They're both nuclear powers. So there's always the worry that a small conflict could escalate into a nuclear conflict if these countries aren't able to come to some sort of resolution. And this has been ongoing since the partition of India, way back since the 1940s. This has been an ongoing issue. Kashmir has been a dispute between India and Pakistan. So in summary, in this lesson you learned that a country is a sovereign, governed territory, while a nation is a group of people with a common heritage. Borders are determined by a variety of factors, including natural features, lines of latitude, and other negotiated boundaries. And when a country cannot agree upon a border dispute may occur.